Hello, everyone, and welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 83 today, and we are talking to Adé Adeniji, who is a coach, facilitator, and organizational consultant. So, welcome to the show, Adé. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, no, me too, me too. And we're going to be talking about this idea of don't look back. And I feel like this is kind of good advice some of the time, and often well-intentioned advice, particularly if we're dwelling on something, and I definitely have that. But I think it can also really prevent us from learning lessons, perhaps, and making changes to make things better in the future. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this one. And if you happen to be new to the show, Delightful Dissent is a shared exploration of things that people kind of take for granted or maybe overlook or say without thinking about too much and repeat and over apply. So I hope the show gives you some specific ideas that might help you in your personal or professional life. But perhaps more importantly, I hope it might give you some ideas about how you can go out there and challenge assumptions yourself, because this is something I'd like everyone to be doing and to be able to do really regularly. And it's delightful dissent because we might be arguing with prevailing wisdom a little bit. We might be disagreeing with the kind of standard way of seeing the world, but it's not about changing other people's minds or forcing other people to think differently. It's about exploring all of the different possibilities and having some fun whilst we do it. The show is genuinely live, so please do bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. And please be aware that there's the possibility of strong language if that's an issue for you, and also that we may talk about difficult topics. And the topics that we're likely to touch on in today's episode are related to trauma, marginalization, stigma, and perhaps abuse as well. So if any of those are particularly difficult for you, then please take whatever steps you need to make yourself comfortable. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is all about asking questions and exploring. So if you're watching live, please do add your comments and we'll try and bring them into the conversation. If you're watching the recordings, then please do get in touch with either of us with the details that will be shared at the end of the show and also in the show notes. So enough of the kind of preamble bit. Ade, we were introduced by another guest, one of my other guests, Christy Byerly, and I really loved our conversation, particularly struck by how really knowledgeable yet compassionate you were, and the being able to combine those two things. So I'm so glad that you agreed to be on the show. Could you perhaps introduce yourself a little bit and the kind of people you like to work with?
So I'm a coach, an organizational consultant, group facilitator, and I'm really drawn to working with people who are curious to be the best version of themselves. I'm really passionate about working with people to be more integrated in how they're showing up personally and professionally. So one of the things that really ignites my passion is working with people that are able to bring all aspects of themselves into spaces. I think very often when I'm talking to people, personally and professionally actually, there's always this sense of what part of me do I need to leave behind in order to feel safe? What part of me do I need to leave behind in order to feel this sense of belonging? And so I'm really passionate about being in spaces where people are able to lean into being brave and feeling safe enough to show up in the best possible ways that they can. And I think this is really important professionally, actually, because very often when it comes to certain emotions, certain ways of being, people feel they can't be their fullest self in workspaces.
Absolutely, that's a really, really lovely way to put it, and I mean, and such a challenge. Particularly, my work with neurodiversity. It's the problem with masking, camouflaging, it's unfortunately it's entirely understandable, and sometimes, but when we do, we cut off a whole load of the strengths and the abilities, and particularly the more kind of qualitative, intuitive side, I think. And yeah, it's a real loss, and it's just incredibly hard work. as well. I think that's the other side of it. It's exhausting and tiring. So it's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Um, how did you come to doing this work? What brought you to doing this particular thing?
Well, I trained initially as a lawyer, and somewhere during that journey, realized I wasn't so interested in the law, and but I was interested in people. So I started to move into human resources, which in my mind was about people in organizations. The higher I went up in organizations, the more I realized that it started to be less about people, but more around processes, policies, very black and white, what's right, what's wrong, who's good, who's bad. And I was really fascinated by the shades of gray. That was really, really what was igniting my passion. I discovered the work of Dr. Brené Brown a while back, and I really loved what she was talking about in terms of the role of empathy, compassion, belonging, in how people are showing up. And so I trained in her research, so I run programs based on her work, and that really just opened up so many avenues for me, actually, in terms of the work I do with people personally and the dialogues I have with people, sorry, personally and professionally.
Mm, thank you. Yeah, and I think that that kind of more emotional, more felt, more intuitive side of work is finally getting the attention that it deserves a bit more. And it's so important for both, these kind of broader well-being things, but also for success in organizations. I think it's one of the strange things is people talk about it as this kind of almost nice to have, but in my experience it's actually vital. All organizations that do well financially, materially, actually get this right a lot of the time.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, what I certainly discovered when I first went into the world of work, it was all about the head, like taking in my intellect. And the longer I started to navigate that workspace, the more I realized that it involved me bringing in my heart, my
Mm,
emotions, and also my intuition as well.
mm, absolutely. So before we get fully into taking on our assumption, I always like to ask people to share a quote that they feel resonates for them and kind of open things up a bit. So have you got something that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I do. I do. Well, the first time I heard this quote, I remember going, "Oh my goodness, this is just so awful. I just hate this quote." But there was something so powerful within it that really stayed with me. And it's by William Faulkner. And the quote is, "The past is never dead. It is not even past. The past is never dead. It is not even past." And I think it kind of relates to our subject matter today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really, really powerful. But what does it, how does it show up for you in this? What is it that made you want to share that particular quote?
For me, there's something around in the moment, I can feel very present, very connected to what's going on. But if I pause long enough, what I often recognize is there's some pattern from the past, there's some belief from the past that is playing out in the present. So we're in this conversation right now. I'm feeling really, really present with you, really open. And at the same time, if I pause long enough, I can go, oh, actually, there's some old behaviors, there's some patterns that are kicking in terms of how I'm showing up. So one of my patterns is around control, wanting to know what's coming next and trying to preempt and all of that. And so in our conversation now, it's about me being present to, ooh, don't let the past, that controlling aspect, take over the dialogue. Let go of that to the best of my ability and be fully present. So yeah, the reason that it sort of resonates for me is recognizing that we're not born in the moment. What happens is our past, very much like ghosts, accompany us into the present.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful thing. It almost it speaks to the kind of unavoidability of taking where we've been with where we are now. We have to arrive in the present having been through what happened beforehand. There isn't a way around that. And it feels like there is if we forget that, we miss out on understanding important aspects of the present.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And it can be scary. It can be scary to confront the past. I mean, I certainly grew up with a belief of don't look back, don't look back. My mother was a Christian, and one of the stories I remember hearing quite a lot of when I was growing up was the story of Lot's wife, who is leaving, after Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're told, do not look back. And so she looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. And somehow that story always stayed with me. Like looking back, there is this risk of getting stuck and not being able to move forward. And the older I get, the more personal work I do, the more I start to recognize that there is a difference in looking back and getting stuck in the past. So you can look back and get stuck, or you can look back and go, oh, okay, and keep moving forward. And I think there is that sort of difference there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with our assumption, this idea of don't look back, there almost feels like a really subtle way that you can kind of get stuck in the past by not reflecting on the past.
Yeah.
Is if there are patterns that are happening below the surface that are repeating, they can hold you in place in a way that actually feels really quite stuck in the past in a funny way. You're using patterns that don't relate to what's going on right now.
Yeah, definitely. So in my work, I also work as a mediator, and one of the things that often comes up in mediation and sometimes in organizational consulting is when there's a conflict situation, people can sometimes go, that's too difficult for me to explore. I'm just going to ignore it and pretend it never happened. So in relationships, there are always going to be ruptures. That's just the nature of it. So when there's a rupture, what do I do? Do I confront it or do I just ignore it? And very often when I'm working with people, what tends to show up is this fear of conflict that wasn't born in the moment. It wasn't necessarily to do with that other person. It was some residue remnant from the past. Sometimes it could be in the home that they grew up in, observing the conflict that was taking place between either parents or their caregivers. It might be at school, it might be neighbors, but there was some sort of narrative that was formed around, conflict, emotional discomfort, let's move away from that. And now as adults in the workplace, that is somehow playing out, and people are not really confronting those issues by nipping them in the bud.
Yeah, I guess if we can't look back, we can't differentiate past and present.
Yeah.
We can't say this is what happened to me before, and that's not what's happening to me now. It feels like the same thing. It's all lumped. It's like if we don't separate them out, they are all just like the quote. Actually, they are all present.
Yeah. The past is never dead. It is not even past. So what do we need to do to pause and go, is the past playing out here? Like what's going on? I mean, my big breakthrough with this was many moons ago. A relationship had come to an end, and I was, relationship coming to an end, in pain, distraught, and all that kind of stuff. And there was this moment where I paused and I went, hold on a second. Even though this person was different from previous relationships, there was a common theme with this particular person. And I started to track back to my childhood. And what dawned on me was there was some behavioral dynamics that I had with my father that was playing out in that relationship with my boyfriend at the time. And I was like, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And that really made me very curious to start to examine the past and question, okay, how can I be much more conscious in how I'm showing up so that that past is not constantly playing out in the present?
Yeah, absolutely. There's something about where we get our models from, where we get our ideas about how stuff should work,
Yeah.
how stuff is.
Yeah.
And a lot of that arises by chance of birth, or by chance of whatever we've encountered in life.
Yeah.
And it feels like without, if we can't step outside of that if we don't reflect on it in some way, if we don't say, okay, this started and this is why, but then we could change that, we could do something different.
Yeah. I'm curious, when you hear that quote, the past is never dead, it is not even past, what comes up for you?
I think it's an interesting thing. I think of the way I think about it is stuff does fade. Stuff disappears over time. But it never really, once something's happened, it's always there in an interesting way. There's a presence there. And I think there's something for me that can feel quite uncomfortable and potentially a source of difficulty, partly because you can focus on the bad things that have happened, but it also actually means the good things that have happened don't, we don't have loss in quite the same way. If we lose someone we care about, for example, their presence is still with us in some meaningful way, even if they're not with us anymore. In that, so I think there's a kind of positive and a negative to it. It's about, it really makes me want to engage with that for what it is, almost. I think there's something in this about being willing to engage with it without getting stuck in it, which is an interesting, and the flip side of it not even being past is like, well, it is part of the present, so what is in the present is present. It's not the past. It's that kind of, there's a kind of slightly weird, is it like if it shows up for us, it's not the past.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Yeah. And I'm struck by what you said about, stuff does fade. And when I hear that, what I recognize is the impact of stuff fades, the impact that it has, and sometimes it transforms into something completely different. Oprah Winfrey often talks about transforming our wounds into wisdom, and so that thing from the past could very easily have been really, really painful, could have been traumatic, could have been just put us in a state of collapse. But maybe through therapy, coaching, personal reflection, or have you, those wounds, those traumas start to transform into wisdoms. It doesn't minimize it, but the way that we kind of look at it is very different from the way that we might have looked at it in the past.
Yeah, and I think it's, for me, wisdom and potentially change. It's an interesting thing to reflect on my own work. And to think, I'm aware that a significant amount of my work is about making sure that other people don't experience some of the things I did growing up, in terms of the experiences as a undiagnosed autistic and ADHD person, with and the difficulties that I faced in school in particular. And in the workplace, but also on some level accepting those and understanding that that was with the best will in the world, with the best knowledge we had at the time, I was given what was available, but now we know more, now we know differently, now we know better, and we can change that. And I feel for some people it feels like it's you like falling into one or the other, like, it's the being angry, holding on to the kind of anger or the injustice or the too much can get you stuck. But it's something for me about it, the flowing through you, being able to allow it to move and to create the change that it wants to create. is a really important part of it, which stops that stuck loop a little bit, which stops, because I've met people who are similar, who have kind of, who are just angry at the world and angry at themselves for the experiences that they've had. And I kind of am angry on some level, but it's about letting it act, letting that have a positive effect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm reminded of another quote, and I always forget who said it. I want to say Jack Cornfield, but it might not be Jack Cornfield. And the quote is, "The pain of the past is often held in suspension until we're ready for it to find us." The pain of the past is often held in suspension until we're ready for it to find us. And the way that quote sort of shows up for me is recognizing that that stuff from the past might have been really, really painful, might have been really, really awful. And maybe I'm just not ready to let go of it. But at some point, something happens. I meet that pain, and the impact of it starts to dissolve somehow. So when I think about that relationship I talked about, which was over 20 years ago now, when it ended was really, really painful. Like I thought, oh, I'm never gonna find love again. Life is awful and all that kind of stuff, playing all these love songs and all of that. And now when I look at it now, I'm like, oh, my goodness, like all that pain is just not there anymore. But I needed to allow that pain to find me, to meet me, because in meeting that pain, it started to dissolve. And there's a difference between meeting the pain and clinging to the pain and not letting go or running away from the pain. I think in meeting it, something starts to transform.
I think allowing that transformation is a scary thing. Allowing ourselves to be changed is can be a very scary, difficult thing. One of the things that's really helped me understand this in my own experience and other people's is this idea of, is that actually we don't really seek comfort in the way that a lot of people talk about it. We seek familiarity.
Yeah.
And if our familiar is uncomfortable, we seek discomfort in specific ways. We seek that specific pattern of discomfort because it's familiar. And that's, I think, that idea of, is what is familiar, is what feels safe because it feels like what I have experienced before. Is that actually serving me? Is that helpful? Is that making me happy? Is that making other people happy? And I think that I think, to some degree, the fear of engaging with those feelings is partly in the knowledge that might change.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the projects I run called The Quest, we work with gay, bi, queer men, helping them step into the fullest of their lives. And as part of that process, we go back to the beginning of each person's life, where they start to track some of the stories that have shaped who they are and how they're showing up. And there's often a lot of resistance to going back and identifying those moments where perhaps the love they received was good enough, but it wasn't what they really needed. And so very often people feel this sense of loyalty to the parents or caregiver, which sometimes is getting in the way of that transformation, liberation, and freedom. So it's familiar. It's what was known. And in a way, what was known was uncomfortable, but it's not really what they needed. So an example might be, a young boy who is age, 6, 7, gets home and starts telling mommy and daddy, oh, there's a boy in class and I really liked him. I think I love him. And immediately parents starts to go, ooh, my boy is saying he loves another boy. What's going on here? This is really, really wrong. And maybe uses some words to that child to say, oh, that's not really the way that boys are meant to be. Or maybe a young boy is weighing what are traditionally female clothes, and the parent goes, no, you can't wear that. Now, there is a loyalty that that child might feel, and they might go, well, it's just the way my parents were, that's how they grew up, it's what society was like at the time. And so there's some sort of loyalty there. And so what we try to do with this exploration is recognizing that looking at the past, yes, can be challenging, can be painful, but if we don't really look fully at the past, it's going to hold us hostage. And I know for myself, it did that for a really, really long time. It held me hostage because I was playing out in terms of my behaviors, doing things that really didn't tie in with how I wanted to be as a human being.
Yeah, sorry, that does very much land in a lot of ways, and I think, there's something for me about what stories have we picked up about ourselves from the way that we've experienced the world, and there's, I feel like there's a when essentially, I guess, when we experience something that is an injustice on some level, that doesn't treat us with dignity, that doesn't treat our experience, that doesn't validate our real experiencing of the world, that acts to invalidate it. We kind of have a choice. We can either get angry at the other person, but when that's a caregiver, that's not a safe thing to do. Or when that's an authority figure in general, that's not a safe thing to do necessarily. So we tend to internalize it. Yeah. And we tend to think we're the problem.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting for me and my own experience is we can make ourselves a problem. we actually can make ourselves, if we almost become the thing if we believe that about ourselves. There's something very powerful in that, the way that we internalize that story, that can lead to it showing up over and over again and repeating itself. And I think without this reflection on what has been, it's very hard to work out what those things are and spot where those patterns are occurring, where they're not really us, but they're a story that we've been told that has kind of stuck for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is so true. And as I listen to you say that, what's also coming up for me is the collective impact of that, the intergenerational impact of that. So if I'm living in a household where I am sort of holding on to all of that, what's going on with my father, what happened with his father and his father and his father, like, if no one within the family system, within the collective system, is breaking that silence, is doing something to challenge those notions, it just leads to this intergenerational pain and trauma.
Yeah, and I think, intergenerational and also breadth-wise, we kind of play out those models with the other people around us in general, potentially. It's one of the very interesting things from my neurodiversity work is some of the most dangerous, really, people for a neurodivergent person to be around is a similar neurodivergent person who has a trauma-based model of the world that they haven't got under control, that they're repeating on the world, that they'll imprint on other people without even realizing that's what they're doing, and without being able to say, no, actually, this was helpful, but now it isn't, or this is helpful in a given context, but not this one. And instead it becomes that I must always do this. I must always react in this way. I must always. And those always is that they're so dangerous. Actually, they can do harm, but that because they kind of have this almost contagious quality sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, that brings to mind a theme that comes up consistently in the work that I do, which is around having difficult conversations. Engaging in difficult conversations is a theme that comes up time and time again. And very often, when I pause long enough with the people I'm working with, it tends to be something from the past that has brought up this fear of engaging in difficult conversations. So it might be I tried it once and it was really, really awful, and I vowed never again to engage in that difficult conversation. Or I saw someone in my home engage in a conversation and it developed into, I don't know, sometimes fighting, sometimes physical words being exchanged. So there's some sort of story from the past that often prevents people from engaging in those uncomfortable conversations. You know, we see this in the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging spaces where someone might use a phrase or a word that is not acceptable, and the person who is on the listening side goes, shall I say something? Maybe I shouldn't. Am I going to be seen as a woke police or the PC brigade or a difficult person? Oh, I'm not going to say anything. And then maybe 2 hours later, they're like, oh, damn, I wish I'd said something. I wish I'd said something. But it takes courage to lean in and go, okay, this is a new moment here. What can I do to let go of the past and actually engage in that honest and open dialogue?
Yeah. And I think it's also for me, actually both of those examples, both the how we engage with the whenever we feel that urge and maybe we back off from it. Um, there's a skill question as well for me, is if we don't get to engage with if we've because we learned early on that this wasn't safe, we never get the chance to practice. We never get, I think there's a really big part of this that's actually about being in a safe enough place where we can make mistakes with it, where we can say the wrong thing, where we can because where we can say the thing out loud that isn't where we've accidentally bought in the past, and then be able to get it out and say, oh, sorry, no, that isn't now, that was before, and be able to tease, like, untangle those things because they come out tangled so often. There's something about, first of all, being able to do that in a way so we can build up the skills to do that and be sharp with it, and to contain other people's unskillfulness and their own messiness. Because I think, as like you say, you need to hold a lot if you're going to challenge someone, particularly in the workplace around language. Very often, it can actually be a very difficult thing to do. And I think, knowing when we have the capacity to do that, when it is actually reasonably safe for us to do that, when it isn't, is a really important thing to be able to say and be able to decide and say, okay, I can stand up and say this. Or to know internally, it's not, okay, I can't challenge this person now because I don't have the resources personally, or the context isn't actually safe for me to do so.
Yeah, and I think as part of that exploration, one of the things that has certainly helped me is in those moments checking in with what limiting beliefs are coming up for me right now. So if I'm not speaking up, if I'm not sort of challenging something, checking in what's going on internally for me. So it might be a limiting belief of I'm stupid, I'm not good enough, I don't matter, I'm wrong. And the next layer to that is, okay, can I recall when that limiting belief first came up for me? Because very often that limiting belief, it's like a wound that is being activated. The wound was not created in the moment. The wound was already there, but something in that situation is inflaming that wound. And if I'm able to go, oh, actually, this is an old wound that is feeling really, really sore right now, I know for me, it enables me to feel safe enough and brave enough to engage in a dialogue. But sometimes that part of the brain that processes rational information goes offline, and I just go into the fight, flight, freeze, collapse. But if I'm able to pause and go, oh no, this is simply the past playing out in the present, and I have agency to actually do something different.
Yeah, I think having that space, realizing when I have that space and when I don't, is a really big thing for me. And there's definitely a pattern here of, when you talked about it going badly in the past, I think we can learn, it can learn to be a scary thing when it does go badly, and it becomes more overwhelming, and we haven't processed the old stuff, and that itself can make it a very, very difficult thing to engage with at all. And it almost becomes harder each time that it happens because there's more stuff on top of it, which makes the risk greater, the energy greater, and giving ourselves the space, doing what we have to do to allow ourselves the space, I feel like is a lot of the work, and that can be quite a difficult thing in and of itself, because quite a lot of workplaces in particular don't incentivize giving ourselves that space. They don't. It's not seen as the right thing to do. Perhaps it's not seen as productive, or it's not seen as being a team player, or it's not seen as a whole load of other things. Whereas it's actually very helpful. But I genuinely think that's a real difficulty I've experienced, is that pressure to act, to do, without being able to step back first.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm imagining myself as one of the people who is maybe watching our dialogue right now and going, oh, this is so very warm and cozy. They're in agreement. There are bound to be people out there who are like, no, looking back is just really, really bad. It's really, really bad. There's this part of me, as we're having this dialogue, that's like, oh, such a luxury. We speak from this privileged place of, yeah, looking back, and someone is like, I'm struggling to pay my bills. I'm struggling to, meet my physical needs. I've got no time to look back. I need to keep looking forward. And so I just wanted to bring that into the space, because I certainly do have family members and friends who are like, look, looking back is the equivalent of wallowing. And wallowing is just not something I can afford for whatever reason. It might be someone is marginalized, someone has faced loads of discrimination all their life, and all they can do is just keep looking forward, because to look back holds a risk of just getting stuck like Lot's wife.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, it's less around, it's not necessarily that you should look back either. That's a really important point. It's not that we're replacing one with the other, because you're right. I think it would definitely turn into wallowing. It would definitely turn into difficulty. And neither, this is one of the really interesting things around actually DEI work in particular, is the expectation that we as marginalized people have a responsibility to fix our marginalization in the workplace, have a responsibility to hold other people's unhelpful and prejudiced and outdated views carefully and unpick them for them, or to even challenge them. That's why I said when we, and I think, is there has to be that looking back is work. It might be valuable work, but we don't always have the capacity for it, and neither do we necessarily have the personal responsibility to do it. I think that's actually and there is a a kind of saviorish, and I know I tend towards the savior side of the drama triangle, so I know this in me, and it's like that's a real risk of looking back, is that we can kind of overdo it, and we can get pulled out of the present. So yeah, I completely agree, and I think what's really important for me though is it's not a moral obligation.
Yeah,
it's a personal thing. It's like, it might be useful to you as an individual, and that's something that's worth considering, but you don't have to do it for everyone else.
Yeah. I'm probably a bit more fundamentalist than
How do you feel about it?
um, I feel that if an individual is really committed to showing up as the fullest expression of who they are. Maslow talks about that peak, the transcendence, the self-actualization, that if someone is really committed to being the fullest that they can be as a human being, as a parent, as a partner, as a colleague, then there's no way that they can do that without looking back, without trying to get an understanding of the experiences that have shaped them to be who they are in the moment. Like I mean, there might be a way, there might be people listening to this going, you know what, Dave? There is a way. I haven't found that way of going, I can get to that peak. I can get to that integrated self without looking at the stuff that have shaped me to being who I am today. What I will say, though, is for anyone who looks back, it's to remember that they also need to look forward as well. So to not get stuck, because that can very easily happen. That can very easily happen. So, I, from time to time, get contact dermatitis, a form of eczema. And the doctors always say to me, don't scratch it. Like, don't scratch it. But there are moments where I start scratching and I tell you, I just can't stop.
Oh, it feels so good. It's
Oh
so good.
my
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
I had this last night. Like it was itching and I started scratching and then it starts to bleed and it's like, oh, I need to stop. But I can't stop. And it's the same thing. It's like you could scratch a little bit, if it's really uncomfortable, but remember that you need to stop because otherwise it's going to bleed. And I love that as a metaphor for the looking back, looking forward. It's about, yes, do look back. There's loads of wisdoms, loads of insights you can get from that. But remember that you also need to look forward as well and keep moving. Don't get stuck. Don't become that pillar of salt.
Yeah. I think it's that, the fear is that if we look back, we end up stuck in the past.
Yeah.
But I also feel like, there's a risk if we don't look back, because the past and the future have an inextricable relationship. We're only understanding the future in terms of what's happened beforehand. That's how we're understanding the future.
Yeah.
And I feel like if we want a really accurate guide to the future, we to some degree need to understand the past.
Yeah.
Otherwise we won't break out of the patterns. We'll make the same mistakes. And I think it's also worth remembering, though, that the past is different than the future. I've always found the idea the history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, is one of my favorite kind of quotes on that one. Is like, that there are these kind of patterns that we can look at whilst remembering that they're not the same thing.
Mm.
And there really does feel like there's holding some very opposed ideas in your head at once to do some of this. It's hard to do. And if we are in survival mode, I think, and there's a really interesting thing is like, I think we can stay in survival mode too long, but we can also genuinely be in survival mode, and for good reason. Don't look back is not appropriate if our survival depends on us doing the next thing and doing the next thing and doing the next thing. That isn't, it's like if you're being chased by a tiger, then it's not, then you don't want to be sitting pondering your childhood trauma. That's not an appropriate. But the difficulty in that is sometimes your childhood trauma can make it feel like you're being chased by a tiger when you're not.
Yeah. 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 Of course. Yeah. So it might be I'm at work, um, I'm in a meeting, I say something, and the person chairing the meeting maybe ignores me or says something that I consider rude back to me. And that might trigger memories of, my father and uncle being at school, and I get caught up in that memory. I might go into freeze, fight, flee, and it's beneficial. I could go, oh, this is that old memory that's been triggered, and then I could actually, I'm an adult now. I've got agency. I'm not that victim anymore. I can respond to it. And I think sometimes what can happen is if we've not looked back to do that processing, we can get caught up in that moment. And I can go, oh, he's such a jerk. Such a such a jerk to say that to me. Um, Rather than me engaging in a conversation with that person.
Mm.
Or vice versa. It could be that I triggered something in this other person as well.
And I think this is one of the interesting things, to reflect on is we are, and this isn't to excuse it, but to help understand it so we can work with it better, is when we don't fit other people's categories of how the world should work, we do trigger quite profound things in them.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Like profound fears, existential fears. And understanding that is helpful in keeping ourselves safe, actually. I think primarily, and helpful in keeping ourselves well and psychologically healthy. But it is true that we are, that our being somehow causes that in them.
Yeah.
And and that's based on their past stories and their understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I face this constantly when I'm in spaces where I am either the only or in the minority. So sometimes that might be I'm the only male. Sometimes it might be I'm the only black person. Sometimes it might be I'm the only gay person. Sometimes it might be I'm the only of all those three
Mm.
together. And in my system, what often comes up is this space is dangerous. I am not safe in this space. And there have been times where the external, it might be the facilitators, what the group members are doing, is they're actually creating this safe space, this safe enough space. But my body is still playing catch up because my body has memories of times where I was the only or in the minority and I was not safe. So my brain is here, but it's not here at the same time.
Mm.
And I think me having that understanding has really helped me when I go into spaces now, when I can go, is this to do with now or is this to do with then?
And
Yeah.
I think the other side of that is that can keep us safe in the present too. It's one of the really interesting things, and I only understood this as someone who's had social anxiety for as long as I can remember, and anxiety in general, is actually for a lot of people, when we talk about anxiety culturally, we think of people who are just more afraid. But that isn't often how it really works. It's actually disordered anxiety in the sense that we are afraid of things that don't represent a threat. But we're also, because of that, or the other side of that, is we often miss things that are genuine threat. And I think, being able to differentiate between the past and the present also means that we don't have to throw out all of that experiencing of the world and all of those feelings that we're feeling in the present and say, oh no, these are just a past story. Because they might be a present story, and that might be a message that's trying to keep you safe and is genuinely trying to keep you safe, instead of a message that's trying to keep you safe from something that isn't there anymore.
So what do you do in those situations to get clarity on that? Because it can feel very entangled in the moment.
If I still have the capacity and the space, I try and sit with it enough to start disentangling it. and knowing how I like to do that, how I like to process. And I think you mentioned processing, and I think that's a really big part of it. It's like, how am I working through this? Knowing the ways that you like to do that and understanding that, I know that I move physically, or I write about it, or I do whatever. There's different ways, and just understanding your own ways of processing. I think understanding when you are beyond your capacity in a situation, and having the being able to step back. And part of being able to step back is in the moment and just saying it. Part of being able to step back is being aware of situations where you can, and making that potentially a condition of your participation. I think it's there's a real aspect of this that's about sometimes saying, this space genuinely is not for me, and I actively choose not to participate, rather than being included. And interestingly, you mentioned belonging right at the beginning, which is one of my core themes of my work as well, is when we're included but we don't belong, when we're conditionally included, when it's actually when we have to perform in very specific ways in order for our space to be safe for us, that we can make a conscious choice whether we want to participate, rather than it being about someone else and their judgment of us.
Yeah. So one of the things that helps me in those moments is checking in. Is my behavior based on my wisdom, or is it based on my wounds? So in those moments where I'm going, okay, I'm making a choice whether I participate or not, sometimes that choice, I'm making it based on my wounds, actually.
Yeah.
And when I say wounds, I'm talking about the past, my unprocessed past. And sometimes it's coming from a place of the wisdom of, this is very conscious. I've paused on it. I've really looked at the things surrounding that. And this is an informed decision. And that's one of the ways that I often use to check in when I'm in situations where I feel like I'm at those crossroads. It's like, which way do I go here? And so to pause and go, is it coming from my wound, or is it coming from my wisdom? Because my hope is to live most of my life from a place of wisdom. But I'm human, and I know that there are going to be many, many times where the unprocessed wounds take over.
Absolutely. And I think all the space we can give us, for me, it's sometimes just realizing and getting to that point, I'm feeling in my body and being like, there's energy here. I'm not sure what it is. And giving myself the space to take a breath, the space, or giving myself, I think it's that being able to step outside of a situation, sometimes physically, and be like, I need a minute to do the processing in my own way, giving myself that to tease those apart. Because so often, for me in the situations, it's not an either or. It's very often a which aspects of the situation are the reality and the present, and which aspects are the story and the past. And untangling those, giving myself the time and the space to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But that requires spotting when it's happening and being in a situation that I can do that in. So it's not always available at all.
Yeah. I mean, a good practice for those who are watching, listening to this, is journaling. Journaling to that question, what are some of the stories that have shaped me to be who I am today? And just getting a page out and just writing, not thinking about it, not thinking about grammar, spelling. I just write, what are some of the stories that have shaped me to be who I am today? Because it's like putting together a jigsaw to form a picture. And so for those people who are maybe reluctant, resistant to looking back, I would say be curious, play with it, see what emerges. And just, go on this scavenger hunt to see those stories, and see what emerges from those stories.
I love that. I think that's such a lovely way to wrap it up, is that we don't look back, with an intent, but with curiosity. That we can be curious about the stories that brought us here.
Yeah.
And the stories that have worked, that have served us.
Yeah.
And still be, is this what I want now, right now? And we can always pick them up again. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
It's not permanent that we put something down necessarily, but it's about being able to, it feels like, rather, it's about connecting the past and the present and the future. Joining it up, integrating it, rather than treating it all as these separate things.
Yeah, because it's a continuum. It's
Yeah.
I think when I was much younger, I used to feel that they would get to a stage where the past is just gone and I'm here now, and that's just not relevant at all. And then the future would arrive, like you see in the movies.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, okay, we're now in the future. We don't need to think about that anymore. But it doesn't work that way. The past is never dead. It is not even past.
It's always unraveling, always unfolding, continually. Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. I think that's quite a good place to sum it up and to start wrapping up, honestly. Thank you so much for such an amazing, kind of deep and far-ranging conversation at the same time. If people want to get in touch with you, we've got your website and your LinkedIn in the show notes, so people can get in touch either way. Is there anything specific that you'd like to share, or any particular things you'd like people, if people are thinking what they'd like to ask, or how, anything particular you'd like to ask?
No, if people are curious to find out more about any of the things I've talked about, they can certainly reach out via those methods that you talked about. I'm really fascinated about the world of emotions. And so for those people who don't know about Susan David, who wrote the book Emotional Agility, would encourage them to check that book out. It touches on some of the themes that we've been exploring, or the work of Brené Brown. The amazing resources on her website, including her podcast, where she touches on a range of subjects. So checking out Brené Brown or the work of Susan David as well.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you for reminding me of the Emotional Agility book, because I read it a while back and it's kind of integrated, but it hadn't come to the surface, and I found it particularly useful, and it was a really excellent book. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Really enjoyed this, and yeah, thank you, and for the work that you do.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Super, thank you, and I hope this got you thinking in the audience, and really, helped you with move forward with a little bit of this. And so if it got you thinking, got you asking some questions, please do share it with someone else you think might find it useful, because that's largely how this show grows, and how we find the people that might benefit. You can take a look at matthewbelringer.com for more about me and more of my other stuff and other related things. And Delightful Dissent itself as a show is taking a kind of short winter break. So we're going to be back in the new year with Zanny Stavert, who is a neurodivergent content creator and seamstress. And we're going to be talking about the idea attention seeking. And I think, interesting link to our current conversation about the attentional value, how much the past might draw our attention or not. But, I have such an ambiguous relationship with attention, my own and other people's. And it definitely doesn't always feel that comfortable or something I want. So, and I've definitely been accused of attention seeking, even when I definitely haven't been, when I've been intending the opposite. So I think it's a really, really interesting one to explore. And we're going to be doing that at 5 p.m. UK time on Tuesday, the 9th of January. So I very much hope to see you all then. In the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.